bastards. Hello, hope you're well. So today we are doing a cam belt, just the cam belt, not a kit, doesn't need one because all the components were new. The cam belt was new. It's been sat around for a while. So we're putting a cam belt on it. I mean, it's an XUD, they're piss easy. So it's a nice little job for the afternoon, having spent the morning being fisted for the most expensive pipe I think I've ever bought. But when you're buying unobtainium, you know, you pay the price. So anyway, let's chuck a cam belt on a car. So if you wind out the 10mm adjusting bolt on the alternator before undoing the 13mm lock nut, then you can wind it out by hand rather than having to work against the belt pressure. It's all going a bit rusty and manky in here. I think the car needs also getting it's growing moss, mould, and I don't think being in here is doing it any good, so it needs to go home. So anyway, with that wound off and the 21mm swing bolt on the underside of the alternator undone, then if you undo the 13 lock, which I may have done up quite tight, because why not? There we go. Then you can just push the alternator back by hand and then pop the belt off. Like so. There's not a lot of room down there, but it will pop off, and then pop round and just remove it from the car. The next thing to do, and I'm going to cheat with this, don't ever rely on the lock. I mean, you can use an 8mm drill, don't, they're brittle. Buy the proper tool to lock the crank. But you can't really rely on that to take the force of undoing the crank bolt. So if it snaps off, it ruins your afternoon. Happily on the BE3 and even on this, the ZF4HP, there's a little access plate on the top of the bell housing, which you can't see because it's buried under a lot of stuff. There's a little plastic plate that you can pop off, and then you can use either the proper tool or a screwdriver to lock the ring gear, so that you can undo the bolt. I don't have to do that because I've got an impact gun which will take care of that for me. So I'm going to buzz that nut, not all the way off, I'm just going to slacken it off, so that I can then use the bolt to turn the engine over so I can time it. And none of the engine's locked at the moment, so it can rotate. What I'm going to do is just have a go. There you go, just buzzing that off. I'm not going to wind it back in a bit. I'm not going to do it all the way back up. I'm just going to nip it up enough so that I can turn the engine over on that bolt and get it where I want it. It really is worth investing in a rattle gun. Makes life a lot easier. So with the covers off, one belt, an INA or INA or INA or whatever you want to call it. Now you can't really see it, but there's a hole in the sprocket down there, which currently is around about the 5 o'clock mark. The actual locking hole is sort of between the 3 and 4 o'clock mark, so it's slightly past. It's worth winding it round until you get this about where you want it before trying to put the crank lock in, because if you fumble about with the pin for the crank without checking this first, because the cam runs at half crank speed, it's quite possible that you'll lock the crank and then discover the cam's 180 degrees out. So it's always easier, especially since you can wind the engine over by hand through the wheel arch and keep an eye on that little hole. So when you get that about right, then it's time to try and force the crank pin in, which is not the easiest thing to do. It's a lot easier if you take the starter motor out, because you can see it, because it's actually behind the starter motor, which I can show you on a scrap block. So here's a scrap XUD block. This one's a 1.9, normally aspirated, or was. So the starter motor would live here, and up behind it you've got that little hole, and that is where you want to put your crank locking pin. Doesn't actually want to go through there, it's a bit rusty, and that will go through the other side into the flywheel, or it would if it had a flywheel fitted. This one does not. So it's a little bit hard to get to. It's easier from underneath than it is from up top. So with the crank locked, the cam is now where it ought to be. The injection pump has 2 bolts, or 2 holes, 4 bolts. That's where it wants to be. And the advantage of having cracked that off is that now you can undo that bolt, which is 22mm, without putting a load of tension or pressure, either in this case on the flexi plate or indeed on the locking pin. So you can just pop it off with a socket on a bar, and then off it pops. It's quite a long thread. There you go. Out yonder bolt pops, and then you can wiggle the crank pulley off, which of course the bottom hose gets right in the way off, but there we go. You can tell it's a turbo diesel because it's a one-piece pulley, and you can't really see it in there, but there is your cam belt. So the next thing to do is pop the lower cover off, get that out of the way, and then we'll get the belt off, having locked the cam and the injection pump. So supporting the engine on an axle stand, because you need to take the top engine mount off, and with the top engine mount off you've got access to the belt. The belt, you'll notice now, is really slack because I've undone the tensioner, which is down there, and to be honest, although it looks awful, access isn't that bad. I can show you the tensioner because I've got one over here, and an idler. So tensioner's quite simple. It rotates on there. There's a 13mm nut that locks that, so you undo the 13mm. It's another 13mm bolt in here, and that's what allows it to slide where it wants to be. These sort of self-tension, in the engine mount there is a plunger with a spring that acts on that there plate, that when you fitted the belt and you undo that bolt, because ideally you undo that bolt and then use a square bar to pull the tensioner back and then hold it back and nip that 13mm up. When you undo that, when the belt's on there, the spring pushes it and should tension it. Now, whilst they're not bad, it's worth actually checking the tension, and don't rely on that spring, because let's face it, a lot of them are quite old now, so they don't always apply quite the right amount of pressure. So we'll go through that in a bit. The spring in this one is quite new, so it should be fine. I should also point out, obviously, all I'm doing is replacing the belt, because the tensioner, the idler and the water pump are new. I mean, as is the belt, to be fair, but it's been sat around a while, so I'm not replacing, unless there's any play in them. There shouldn't be, they're brand new. ENA kits are pretty good, so they should be okay. So it's also worth pointing out that this is, although this was actually a later engine, I've converted this back to the clip-on covers, which are significantly easier to get on and off than the later bolt-on covers. You can swap them, it's quite easy. You've got to change the end plate, so everything's got to come off the front of the engine. But it's a lot easier to have the old clip-on covers than the bolt-ons. They tend to ruin your afternoon, especially the bolt-ons. There's a bolt right down the back on the bolt-ons that it's so difficult to get to. Everything's in the way. So clip-ons, choice of champions. So with everything locked up, the crank's locked, the cam has a bolt in it you can't see because it's dark, and there's 2 bolts in the injection pump, so the tensioner is slackened off, so the belt should come off. Also, again, with these things, it's not a huge amount of room. You can either jack the engine up and down with that mount off to give yourself a bit more space, or in this case, because it's on a ramp, I can lower or raise the ramp because the axle stands on the floor, and that will lower and raise the engine in the engine bay. This is really hard to do one-handed, I'll be honest, but given that I don't care about this belt, it's not coming back on. So I'm just going to, of course, there's also a throttle cable right in the way. You can pull them out the top or push them out the bottom, whichever you fancy, really. I'm trying to shove this one out the bottom. That's that bit gone. And if you go down yonder, of course, what I haven't done, like a knob, is take the lower cam belt cover off, which was a bit silly, wasn't it? It's nearly off. What's it catching on? It's just catching up here. So if we shove that down, then there you go, what you end up with. Of course, it's now covered in shit. It doesn't matter, not going back on or cleaning this area up, but there we are, one cam belt I've just thrown on the floor, which, to be honest, you know, it's as good as the day it went on. But yeah, we got one, so I'll chuck a new belt on it. As you'd expect with what are essentially brand new components, there's absolutely nothing to worry about with the idler, the tensioner, which you still can't see, or the water pump. They all feel absolutely fine and brand new, mostly I suspect because they are. So the next thing to do is have a bit of a clean up round here, because of course we did have an oil leak from the cam cover gasket, which is quite common on these, and although none of it's got onto the cam belt, it does have a habit of running down the back of the engine and accumulating off the back of the lower cover, which is precisely what it's done. We have replaced that the cam cover gasket, which is now nice and dry, but obviously there are remnants of moistness down there. Of course, I've also been doing replaced the dozer valve, which it may or may not focus on, it probably won't. That was access isn't great on the turbo diesel. It's doable, but it's not great, and I've still got to wash quite a lot of LHM that sort of disappeared all down the car, so I'll have to wash all that off, but I'll do all that whilst I'm down here doing this. So there's various ways of fitting these that various people say is the right way. I always start these off, so I just kind of get the belt kind of where it wants to be, and then because essentially with these, the injection pump and the cam locked, the belt betwixt the two is kind of at tension, so it can be a little bit easier. I usually start off on the cam sprocket, work it down to the injection pump socket, and I usually just slide them on sort of halfway initially, run it round the idler, and then off down to the crank, and you pull it as hard as you can, because again, it's the tension it wants to be essentially. It's slack this side because the adjuster tensioner is undone. It's slack, so it's around the water pump, and then when I'm happy, it's where it needs to be. But again, it can be quite hard getting this belt between the injection pump and the cam. So what can help, if you're careful, if you pop the lock bolt out and then just use a 16mm spanner on there, just tease the sprocket forward slightly, position the belt on, and then tease it back and put the lock bolt back in, you end up with the belt. You know that there's the right amount of teeth on the belt between the two. So anyway, with that done, the next thing to do is to make absolutely certain that everything is exactly where it should be. So I'm just gonna make sure that the belt is nicely centrally located. Everything is happy. It's round the tensioner that you can't see. It's around the water pump, and it's also worth checking that, because there's enough slack on that, you can end up with the teeth sat on top of, not in the grooves on the water pump. So when it's always worth checking that it is actually located properly. So with all of that located, happy days. The next thing to do is to undo the 13mm on the tensioner and see how well or not it tensions it. It's also given that these, I mean, those cam belts, when you're working on your own, they can sort of pop, you're feeding it on around here and it pops off down the bottom, and they're a bit of a nightmare. But I mean, all cam belt kits now, even cheapy ones, come with useful little tools that you can slip over the sprocket down yonder to stop the belt from popping off the crank, which is dead handy. It makes life a lot easier. Although, again, I mean, XUDs, these are lovely simple cam belts to do. If all cam belts were this easy, then it would be an absolute delight to do them. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this one-handed, but let's see if I can undo, if I can find it. Where are we? Yeah, that's undoing. So it's a bit buried. It's underneath the sprocket. You can get a bit by feel, generally, and when you've done enough of them, you can usually sort of feel it. Of course, the issue I've got is that my deep 13 are broke, so I'm having to use an adapter on this, which it's not ideal because it makes it a bit long to get in, but I think we're nearly at, there we are, we're on it. So if I undo this is really hard one-handed. The tensioner, there you go, will pop. Tensioner has now popped. So the belt on paper should be perfectly tensioned. I mean, that feels pretty good to me. What I will do at this stage is lock off the tensioner, so there's a 13mm bolt and the 13mm nut on the swing arm, and then I'll clean up the lower cover, put the lower cover back on, pop the crank damper back on, crank pulley back on, and again, I'm not going to do the bolt up Bernard tight, just enough so it'll rotate the engine. And then I know some people that don't turn them by hand afterwards. I mean, that is entirely their decision. I always find it's useful to turn it by hand to recheck the tension and make sure it's absolutely okay before you sling it all back together. Some people run them with the covers off. I'm not a big fan of doing that. There's an awful lot of stuff around it that can get in there and destroy it, so I'm not a big fan of that. But it also means if you turn it over by hand before trying to start it, you'll know that you have removed all of the locking bolts, because that will also ruin your afternoon. If you leave that bolt in and you forget about it and then try and start it, it will wreck your engine. So I'm going to chuck the lower cover back on, do the tensioner up, put the crank pulley on, and get all the locking pins out and rotate it. great success. So happy with that. The tension feels absolutely fine. So what I'm going to do now is go to the pub. I'll put the covers back on, and then don't smoke over a cambelt, kids. You get fag ash all over it. It seems to ruin it. So yeah, put the covers back on, get the engine mount back on, and then I can lift the car up, which means I can then wedge the ring gear and do the crank bolt up to... Oh, it's been a while since I've done one of these. I think it's two-stage. I think it's £30 and then 60 degrees or to £111, which is what I usually do them to. So we will do that. So I've never had one come off. Obviously a little dab of thread lock on them, and all should be well. So final stage, of course, on this, the access plate on top of the gearbox is buried. There are reasons for that. You'll also note I've been having endless shenanigans with the hydraulics. The overhauled, or once overhauled a few years back, flow diverter valve is now weeping from the lower ports, both sides. Cars don't like standing. But anyway, there's another little access point here where you can wedge a screwdriver, which is quite handy because it means I can hold a screwdriver this side whilst I pop over here and do that up with the almighty torque wrench. So I will go and get a screwdriver. So happy with that. It rotates fine. So I will put the alternator belt back on, tension that up, chuck the shit shield back in up there, and then I might put the wheel back on, I might not. I might just start it up, see how it runs, and then I mean, there's no reason it shouldn't be fine, but then yeah, once I'm happy it's running okay, then the fun starts with the flow valve, for which I will probably take the radiator out because it makes life easier, and also that there steering, well, I think it's a steering pipe. I was told it was a steering pipe. It's the pipe that goes between the flow valve and the pressure reg, which is metal, rubber, metal, rubber, metal. That has decided to spring a leak. I have managed to find one that's new old stock, still in a Citroen bag, and it was dated June 2004. It's actually stamped on the rubber June 2004. So I got to be the last year of BX parts production, I would imagine. But there's that to do, and then bleed the brakes again, and hopefully I'm now starting to think the security valve might not be the best, but we will sort out at least the bits that are leaking, bleed the brakes, and see if anything has improved. I've not bothered putting the wheel on yet because I want to wash all the LHM off that's disappeared. However, the battery's on. Do that thing with the alarm. I've double checked that the engine turns by hands and all of the tools are back where they came from. So bloody alarm. It runs a bit rough. It's not that's 0 throttle, and as I've said previously, the cold start throttle advance is not attached, so it does cough a little bit when it first starts. This alternator, I don't know why, but it just, you've got to give it some revs before it will start charging. But anyway, there you see, now it charges. It'll warm up pretty quick and the idle will come up and all will be well. But that, job done. So just the leaks to fix. So there we go, nice easy job. You know, I don't really get why people leave them until they go snap. You know, a belt's a lot cheaper than an engine rebuild, and you know, I mean, you can do them in less than an hour. Why would you not? Anyway, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.